Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Mason J. Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today, I have the honor of sitting down with Dr. Evan Offstein, who I first met as a professor at Frostburg State University. Dr. Offstein, Captain Offstein, Captain O, many names that we went and called you. Dr. Offstein was educated at West Point University. Is it university?
No, just kind of West Point.
It's West Point.
The full title is United States Military Academy at West Point, but people just say West Point.
Gotcha, what he said. And then received his doctorate from Virginia Tech and went on to lead at the Virginia Military Institute here at Frostburg State. And also is the principal and co-founder of Excelerated Leadership Partners, who does consulting for currently commercial nuclear power plants, which is incredible, by the way.
Yeah, it's kind of a neat place.
But that company specializes in high hazard risk operations and consulting their leadership.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Seems very important.
Yeah, it's kind of a cool gig.
Joking before the podcast about how, like, specifically in that nuclear power plant site, like, there is absolutely no room for error.
That's right. I mean, they go to get it right every single day.
And they called them the best.
Yeah, I'd like to think so, man.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to start off the podcast just by talking about my experience and why you were such a impactful teacher for me while I was at Frostburg, and then transition into your work as an author. You actually, I think the first class I had with you had all of the students purchase your Stand Your Ground, Building Honorable Leaders the West Point Way, which relates to the West Point school that we mentioned previously. And yeah, I mean, we can just jump right into it. I will give you this, that you were the most impactful teacher I think I ever had through all of my classes, and by far. Like, there is no close second. And while I was preparing for the podcast, I was trying to, like, put my thumb on exactly what it is. And I think the first thing is that the first day of class, both classes that we had, and I realize this is something that you do for all your classes, you gave a speech the first day of class, which I found after the fact to be like maybe a scare tactic, maybe you just oversetting expectations for your class. But essentially what it was, for those who haven't had Dr. Offstein as a professor, you basically came in the first day of class and you said, I'm going to give you guys a realistic expectation of what I expect from you as students and what you can expect from me as a teacher, which off the bat, no teacher has done to the diligence that I feel you did. But basically set, like, the rigid expectation that this class is going to be, for example, the first one I think was like a 2-hour class. You're like, this class is going to be 2 hours long and you can expect to be here for 2 hours and no exceptions. And like, and riddled off what your, expectations were for the entire semester, and you ended the presentation. And by the way, the whole time you're like super stern, super, militaristic in the way that you're giving it. And that's where the scare tactic I felt came in. But
there's a little bit of that.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. And at the end of the speech, you said, if any of you have a problem with this is the time to resign from this class, because this is what it's going to be.
Yep.
And in both the classes that I remember, I don't think anybody left. But I also remember the second day of class, I'm pretty sure we got out early.
Yep.
And I don't know, that was one thing that stuck.
Mason, if I may, for a second, and we're going to be talking about leadership and whatnot over the next hour. I guess we'll be hitting on these key topics, and since you brought it up, and I usually don't really reflect. Most leadership breakdowns, relational breakdowns, involve a violation of expectations. Boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, leader, follower. So I think it's incredibly important to lay out the expectations early, so that there is not a violation of expectations. And I don't I've done things wrong as a leader. I've done things wrong as a professor, as an instructor. But I've never had any student ever at the end of the semester come up to me and say, "You lied to me. You promised me A, but gave me B." So I think, just setting direction, setting expectations, that is a critical part of really any good relationship. But it is central to leadership. Let people know what to expect.
Yeah.
And it goes both ways.
But the other thing too is that, because other teachers would do that as well, but not with the same passion behind their words that I think made the students believe that you were serious. Like, because every first week of classes is syllabus week, where the teachers go over what the semester is going to look like, right? And like every teacher has some variation of setting those expectations, but for some reason, and I think it was the sternness in your words, or just the seriousness, or just the way that you like were able to engage off day one with the students, that is the difference. And led, I can only speak for me, right? I don't know how the other students felt, but like led me to believe that like you were here to be here. You were here to teach. This class is why you are here, and that we as students, should bring that same energy to the classroom.
Yeah. And I think, well, again, I appreciate it, and I'm starting to blush, and my head gets red but
your head gets red.
One of the things that, again, I tied back to leadership. How can you expect your followers to have passion if you don't model that behavior? So, and part of it is, and I feel bad for people that don't love their jobs. I'm a professor. I'm also a principal in this consulting firm, and I guess I'm blessed because I love what I do, and You love the teaching or the consulting? Both. I love
all of it.
I love, and I feel bad for people that don't love their jobs. So do I ever fake it? Do I ever fake the energy? I don't know. I try to be authentic, and it's real. I want to be there, and hopefully, and I guess the feedback that I'm getting from you, that in my teacher evals, and I think they reflect that. Yeah, I bring that passion into the classroom.
You absolutely do. And I'll give you a couple more compliments while we're on it.
Yeah, keep
and
coming,
then,
man.
And then no more. I'm going to cut it off. I don't want your head to get too red.
Okay.
Hey guys, going to take a quick break from the episode just to highlight a sponsor of this season of the Mason J Show. And today we have Spencer Bangert, a loan officer with Fidelity Direct Mortgage, here to offer the listeners of my podcast some free knowledge and education on the home buying process, and hopefully to be your loan officer when it comes to your new home purchase or refinance of the current home you have. Spencer has been in the mortgage industry for over 8 years and run through the home buying process thousands and thousands of times, and that means that he is an absolute expert and will catch the little details that turn into big problems down the road. Spencer is offering a free consultation to any of my listeners to go over your credit and your home buying eligibility to see if you qualify for the home or refinance that you're looking for. All you have to do is send an email to spencer@fdmhome.com, reference the podcast, and that you're there for your consultation. Spencer is somebody that I absolutely trust because I've seen him work firsthand, and I wouldn't put a sponsor on the episode if it wasn't somebody or something that I think would really help you guys out. And I actually mean that. Thank you guys so much. Back to the episode. Spencer's NMLS ID is 1202142, and Fidelity Direct Mortgage's number is 188829. Thanks, guys. The other thing that really I think set the difference is that you made such an effort to engage every single student in the classroom and started off on day one, like working to memorize everybody's name, even the kids with like difficult names. Like you didn't veer away from that. Like you'll ask them like 3, 4, 5, 6 times, like the proper way to pronounce it. But you really work to, I feel like, identify the quiet students in the class and engage them and like ask their opinions and with everyone, even like the more present students. But that was something that I saw you doing that I didn't see a lot of other teachers doing. And this is where it's hard for me to like put my thumb on exactly what it is because like other teachers will ask their students questions, but the students don't exactly care to like put effort into the response. But I got the sense that every student really did think about their responses and care. And I'm trying to like find the words, like put it right, but like cared about their responses to you and cared about how you received their responses, which is very rare, especially like I feel in the college or at any grade level.
Well, again, I appreciate that. And I guess I believe that almost every leader has a superpower. And I think my superpower, I don't know how but names, I can memorize names very well.
Yeah.
We had our consulting firm did a lot of consulting work for Pat Bro, who he's a billionaire in Colorado, and he had a retreat at his Wyoming ranch. It was a pretty incredible. This house was incredible. I don't know how they built a house on the side of a cliff or ridge, and he invited like 20, 25 high-level executives across the country, across North America. And I gave my presentation, but prior to that, there was like a social hour, not coffee hour, drinks, and I was asking people their names, and I gave a half hour later, I'm giving the presentation, and I said, Rick, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
And Rick kind of like, how'd you know my name? Well, so again, I don't know how or why, but I've always been pretty good with names.
But that is like, I think maybe that is the key, right? Because you catch people off guard by saying their name. And this is something that I've picked up kind of in the last few years of like most of my life I went through with just like, hi, how you doing? My name's Mason. Your name's Evan. And then as soon as I turn my shoulder, like that name is out the window. And like, not because like I care or I don't care.
Yep.
It's just that, names are hard. And I think a lot of people listening can relate to that. But putting the effort into learning somebody's name, like, you just touched on, I think is the difference between quickly gaining somebody's, I'll say respect,
Okay.
that, or their maybe,
Well, I think
I don't have the right word for it, but it's just like showing people that you put the effort into learning their name.
Yeah, I think there's
because most people don't put that effort in.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that, and I guess we're getting kind of into the weeds, and maybe a good way here. But one of the most famous leadership books of all time was written like 100 years ago. Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, and I don't know, page number 8 or 9. He talks about the word that people like to hear more than any other word is their name.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, it's building relationships. It's building this personal connections. There's a professor and he's recently joined our consulting firm. I'm a big fan of his. His name is Jeff McClellan. Does that name ring a bell?
It doesn't, no.
He talks about these leadership moments and so knowing somebody's name and building that connection, that is a leadership moment, and you want to accumulate a lot of positive leadership moments. So yeah, something as innocuous as somebody's name, I guess it is important. I want to be called by my first name or my last name, depending upon rank that my military comes through. But I think that's critical, even in emails. And I've said to students in the past, and when we work with clients, like I never send an email to a client with just, hey, it's Natalie, comma, Dan, comma. So even in text messages, I think you and I exchange some texts.
Yeah.
And I try to, I'm not always perfect on this, but in the text, Mason hyphen or Mason comma.
You're one of the only people that do that too.
Yeah.
On every text though. That's why it's kind of comical sometimes, like, but it's also like endearing in a way because like that's very much you, and it, I don't know, there's not words for it. It's just one of those like, one of those personality traits that you have that, I think makes people, appreciate you and being in your circle.
Thank you.
When did your like passion for leadership begin? And like set you down this path that you're on?
That's a great question. I was a pretty good student in high school. I got into a couple Ivy League schools, University of Pennsylvania, got into Penn. But I decided to go to West Point, and part of it was this: you go there to become. Part of their selling point is you come in to learn leadership, and I don't. That's where, God, I made so many mistakes at West Point, but I think that's also the beauty of West Point. At a very young age, you're put into a leadership position, and you get practice. And I think like Frostburg State could do a lot better on this. I think you did a great. You were the president of the fraternity,
Sigma Tau Gamma fraternity. Yeah.
Yep, and that gave you a lot of leadership practice.
Yeah.
Making decisions, setting direction.
Yeah. The way I like to put that fraternity experience is like I had. Like if I was the boss, I had a bunch of employees that like I just couldn't fire and like I had to deal with.
Yes.
And that was as much as some of the guys, and we're probably going to touch on the fraternity a little bit more as the conversation goes, but as much as like I loved and hated all of the brothers in the fraternity at different points, having to deal with those issues and not being able to ignore them was an interesting challenge, to go through, and definitely heartbreaking and heart aching and just like mind numbing sometimes. And just, it was an experience that I don't necessarily want to do again, but I'm very grateful to have been like thrown into that situation early on.
So, I mean, I think that's part of your competitive advantage is that you had that leadership experience, as a 21-year-old man. And at West Point, I mean, going back to the question, where did I get my passion for leadership? And leadership is hard. Just like you said, it is not easy, and I made so many mistakes. But at West Point, you are constantly, from your second, third, and fourth year, you were forced into leadership positions, and so I guess that's where my passion came. And I don't think there is another school out there, maybe the Naval Academy, where you have these leadership opportunities over and over and over again.
If I can interject real quick, for those that aren't familiar with West Point, I do have an excerpt from your book that just kind of gives a little explanation of it. The United States Military Academy at West Point, which was founded in 1802, is a multifaceted institution of higher learning, emphasizing academic growth, military training, physical development, and moral ethical enrichment for roughly 4,000 men and women. In West Point, there's no such thing as good enough, and West Point pushes excellence above all.
Yeah, and the big thing about West Point is that it produces officers. Most of the officers in the Army come from West Point. Now, there's other ROTC programs and whatnot, but Army is or West Point is that is where a good portion of the Army officers
cream of the crop.
I'd like to think so. But that's where my love of leadership came, and then interestingly, I got out. The Army was a great experience for. I've had regrets in my life, Mason. Things have not always gone the way that I've liked. And Veterans Day is just a week from tomorrow. It's coming up. I don't have will never have a regret serving our country. And so as an Army officer, again, I made plenty of mistakes, but practice.
What brought you into the military originally?
Well, I think it was kind of West Point in terms of my grandparents were both in World War II, and I did not come from a military focused family, but I wanted a place where I could be challenged academically. I was a pretty good athlete. I think you and I threw the football a bit. Now, that was another thing about West Point. The physical part kind of attracted me. So, but prior to West Point, I didn't really have a dream of becoming an Army officer. West Point was the mechanism through which I became an Army officer. And then when I was in the Army, again, I had great experiences. As a 25-year-old, I took a team down to Honduras on an intel mission, 10 or 11 guys. And I was just thinking, boy, 25 years old, we're in the jungles of Honduras, and what a great leadership opportunity. So, and then after the Army, I went to work at Corning, went to work at Target, some great leaders at Target, by the way. But I ended up going to the Virginia Military Institute as the assistant commandant of cadets. And again, my passion for leadership. VMI does a pretty good job building leaders, but it was that experience at VMI that said, you know what, I want to be in higher education. I want to study leadership, and then I went down to Virginia Tech and got my PhD with a focus on leadership.
Right. I think there's so many people, my age specifically, that lack good leaders in their life, good role models to follow by. But at the same time, they don't know what a good leader is necessarily, because like your expectation or your top of the line is only what you've experienced.
Yep.
Right. And that was pushed way above when I had your class, because you are definitely a leader, unlike most that I've experienced, which
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. And I think that it's so important, and leadership qualities and morals should be pushed way more. And luckily, with podcasting and social media, people like Jocko Willink and even Casey Neistat or Joe Rogan also, like, these are people who have reached the pinnacle of their platforms.
Yep.
And are pushing these no excuse mentalities, work harder mentalities. Cameron Haynes is the same way. And I think it's so valuable to have people voicing that just out to their followings now, because kids my age need to hear that.
Yeah. And,
that's
a great point. And I don't often really reflect, but kind of going back for a second, I do feel bad for two things, Mason. In commercial nuclear power, which our consulting firm spends a lot of time in, there's a saying, what does good look like? Because when a mistake is made, or what does perfection look like? What does good look like? Sometimes people don't know what good looks like. Going back to West Point for a second, there were role models everywhere. Upperclassmen were role models. There were captains, majors, lieutenant colonels. Everywhere you looked, there was a role model. So, I'm humbled that you think that I was a role model for you. It would be nice at Frostburg State if there were perhaps more role models for kids to look at. Because if you don't have those role models, you don't know what good looks like.
Exactly.
That's a great comment.
Yeah, exactly. And especially in the formative years of the college, and especially like in the fraternity and sorority space, like there's just a drought of proper leadership. And I think, and this isn't meant to be like a hack at anybody, but subpar leaders step in to fill the gaps where, proper leadership is needed. And the leaders who I'll dub as subpar at the moment get their actions encouraged, because there's no, or justified maybe is the right way. I know in your book you touch a lot on rationalizing and the importance of not making excuses. But when you're in a leadership position and there's nobody around you to check you, those rationalizations and excuses go unchecked and uncalled out. And I mean, this is just something I'm noticing. It's not really, I'm not sure where the solution comes in from that.
Yeah. And, again, this is a great comment. And one of the things that I try to do as a professor, one thing that our consulting firm, Excelerated Leadership Partners, ELP, does, we try to provide a lot of feedback. Because to your point, Mason, I don't know, these people are forced into leadership positions, but if they don't get feedback on how to improve, then they can continue thinking what they're doing is right. So I think, and I go back to my time in the Army, I go back to my time at West Point. I think I was getting feedback all the time, every day, every way. A lot of times it was kind of developmental feedback. All the things, hey, you need to do this better. Have you thought about this? Sometimes there's positive feedback. And I think everybody could.
Two questions for you.
Yeah.
What is one of the most common things, whether it's in your experience consulting for the power plants or any leadership position you've been in the past, what is the most common issues that you see in leaders when you first come onto the scene? And what is your approach to address and, bring that up to correct it?
Yeah, I think in general, when we walk onto any organization, a power station, and I'm going to answer this through a story.
Okay.
This summer, my wife and I went to France. So it was my first time spending time in France. We spent 3 or 4 days in Paris, which everybody said, I got a lot of feedback for, hey, in Paris, people may not be that nice. They may not be that patient. I found the French people lovely and patient and accommodating. But then you can see that we get some wine here. I love wine. That's one of my hobbies. Just the whole, I love to drink it, but I love the whole study of it. But we went to Bordeaux, and we went to some elite wineries, and this was awesome. It's 2 places in particular. But the first place, we're in a golf cart, and we're driving among the vines. And I'm looking, and there's a bunch of people in the field, and they're like looking up to the sky, and then they're looking back down. They're hovering over to and I said to the guy that was giving this tour, and there's only like 4 of us on but we were with the winemaker. I said, hey, what's going on? The harvest doesn't happen until October, November. Why are all these people in the field? And he said that they're looking up to the sun, and to make sure that the sun has an unobstructed line of sight down to the grapes. They were cutting the leaves around the grapes so the sun could get to the grapes.
Some attention to detail right there.
Absolutely. And I was like, what? Attention to detail, but I'm like, how do you afford this? Or, isn't that a bit ridiculous? Who does that?
Yeah.
And he said, if you want to be the best, it's all about standards.
Mm-hmm.
And fast forward, 2 days later, we're at another winery, again, an elite place, producing some of the best Merlots and Cabs in the world. And I spent a lot of time at nuclear power stations, unfortunately, because, that my daughter was in this tragic accident. I've been in a lot of hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess when I walk into an organization, I look at housekeeping. How are things, is there good order and discipline? Are things clean? Well, this one winery that we were at, I started looking around, and you walked in and it smelled clean. It didn't smell sterile, but it just smelled clean. And then I started looking around, and at the end, I'm like doing a white glove test. I'm trying to find any dust. Mm-hmm. And I say to the lady, I said, I haven't seen a speck of dust. And she said, no, we clean this place like 2 or 3 times a day.
Dang.
And I said, 2 or 3 times a day. And again, she said, it's all about standards if you want to be the best. So one of the things that Mason, I would say that this is a universal truth. If you look at elite organizations, sports, Pittsburgh Steelers, although it's a down year for them, maybe the Ravens, you're a Baltimore guy, the Patriots, the Packers, or any elite organization, they always have high standards. Mm-hmm. So, what is the one thing that I look for in an organization? It is that's an immediate thing. Are the standards high? Are the leaders communicating the standards? Are they, and related to that, Mason, and Jocko Willink, I think, his book, Extreme Ownership, mm-hmm. This goes hand in hand. Having standards alone is not enough. You need to be accountable to those standards. You have to have a culture of accountability. So one of the things that our consulting firm tries to do is we try to promote this culture of accountability.
If I can interject real quick,
Yep.
You just saying that reminded me of a quote that I wrote down from your book. that says honorable leaders don't seek excuses, they seek responsibility.
Yeah.
Which I read that and that kind of stuck with me. And over the past like 2-3 years, the practice of like eliminating excuses and just being in, as you just said, like with Jocko, like full ownership of everything, oddly takes a lot of stress away from me. Although it adds stress, it takes stress away because I recognize that like everything is in my control now. Like by taking accountability and responsibility for everything, that takes away the unpredictableness of outcomes. Like if I can anticipate what could go wrong and either realize that it's in my control or not realize that it's in my control and then like pivot my actions around that like thought process, that I believe has allowed me to achieve a lot more over the past by making sure that like everything is in my control and everything is planned for, I guess. Okay. Or that there's not, making sure that there's no window where an excuse could be made.
That makes sense. That makes sense. That's an interesting thought.
You have a moment versus dilemma. I think from your story about the winery and the cleanliness and the trimming of the leaves over the grapes, another thing you touch on in your book is being big about the small things.
Yeah.
And those two things, you know, trimming a leaf above a grape so that the sun can hit the grape directly. I mean, that might be the smallest detail, you know, that I may have ever heard of, you know, in the sense of like, you know, agriculture like that. But even the cleanliness of the facility before, and you know, a lot of places have high standards. You know, if you look at McDonald's like code of conduct, I'm sure there's language in there of very high standards, but the enforcement or the leadership directing those standards is what lacks a lot of times that I feel. You know, it's the enforcement or it's the ability to communicate respectfully to, you know, from a boss to an employee, those standards that I feel a lot of times is what makes or breaks relationships between leadership and employees. And that's why like part of that question that I asked you was how do you go about righting wrongs that you see when you step into a company? Like what does your communication look like?
Well, our consulting firm does three primary things: strategic planning, executive coaching, and leadership academies. Executive coaching is a lot like, there are parallels to being a good professor. The way that, and I think one of the reasons why I've been successful as a professor and why our consulting firm has done well is that we have courageous conversations with our
courageous conversations. Go into that a little more. What do you mean?
It means that kind of if we see it, we say it, and we're not going to tiptoe around. One of the things that kind of differentiates how we do our coaching gets a bad name as it almost like a therapist, esoteric. Hey, tell me why you don't like your mom. We don't get it. We talk about performance, and this go back to standards and how are you doing. One of the things that we do, and I don't care if you're a physical trainer, back in the classroom, we talk about standards and we come up with a game plan. It's called a one-page plan. And it basically sets down the mission, vision, some core objectives and core action plans that we're entering in a contract. Once you sign your name on that one-page plan, I'm going to hold you accountable to that one-page plan. Hey, Mason, it said that you do 2 work observations this past week. Have you done that? Wow. Why not? So, you know, I think it's impossible to be a great coach without pushing people, without driving high standards. And so that's one of our mechanisms. That's our core mechanism really to improve leaders is through our executive coaching. But it begins with this plan.
Would you say that delegating accountability is important?
Yeah, I think, well, there's a difference between accountability and responsibility. And I don't think you and I talked about this in class. We talk about the ORCI model, ORCI. So when you come up as a leader, when you come up to a big decision, first off, you ask, who owns the decision? Well, usually it's the leader that owns it. Next, who's responsible? Okay. And usually that's delegation. I'm gonna delegate that. I'm gonna delegate this task down. Now you're gonna be responsible. I still own it, but you're gonna be responsible. And then the C and the I, the C stands for when I come to a decision, who needs to be consulted and who needs to be informed. ORCI. Ultimately, one person owns it. The buck has to stop somewhere. But when you delegate, and delegation seems to be, it's a very hard thing for leaders to do. It's kind of scary because you still own it. You still, ultimately, you're going to be held accountable for whether this goes right.
Right. There's a level of trust.
Yes, absolutely.
That a leader has to have in their.
Absolutely.
What's the word you use? Leadership, and then the leaders lead like constituents, followers. Yep. Yeah, employees.
Yep.
Yeah, because like that's something that I can go back to when I was the president of the fraternity. Trust in getting tasks done was not there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Rightly so. I mean, we were just kids in college that had full class loads to take care of and social lives to maintain, and unfortunately, the work that it took to maintain the organization often got put on the back burner because the guys that I was working with really didn't see much benefit from that work. At least looking back, that's why I feel the motivation to complete it wasn't there. And in that time, delegation was so hard because I could delegate something. I could say, hey, I need you to go talk to Jamie about this, get this done, and let's touch base next week on Monday. Monday comes around, just nothing is done. And then like me being responsible for the decisions and responsible for the organization, now like it falls back on me and we've lost a week, to get that done type of thing. Yep. And like that's problem I don't see happening as much in employment and in jobs where people are getting paid and can be fired. But I think that's an important thing to be on top of early in leadership.
Yes.
Are there ways you establish trust?
Well, I think there are ways, and we opened this whole podcast building relationships, knowing names, being authentic, that builds trust. But I'm going to pull the thread here, and I'm going to use a lot of leaders, not a lot, but some of the leaders that we work with, they say, I'm not going to delegate this because it's not going to be done the way that I want it. And I don't want to teach them. I don't want to spend the extra time to develop them. It's easier for me just to do it myself. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a problem because if you think that way, you're just adding workload. Two really bad things happen. You're adding workload onto yourself. That's one. And then maybe even worse, the person isn't getting developed. But whenever you delegate something, and I learned this, again, going back to leadership lessons from the Army. I was 23 years old, and I had a guy, Captain Moore, pull me aside, and he said, whenever you encounter a performance issue, somebody's not meeting your expectations, you need to ask the KSD. Did we talk about this in class? Do you remember that, the KSD?
You're gonna fail me if I say no.
Well,
I don't recall, but when you say it by the acronyms, I'm not exactly sure.
Okay. Well, 23 years old, I learned this, and I've kept it for 51 years old. Mm-hmm. This is the gift that's kept on giving for me.
Give it to me.
Number one, K. Do people know what's expected? Mm-hmm. A lot of times people say, "Well, I didn't even know that. You didn't clearly communicate the standard to me. I didn't know what was expected." Next, do they have the skill? Do they have the technical skills? Do they have the training? Do they have the skill to do what you're asking? And then 3, do they have the desire? Mm-hmm. Knowledge, skill, desire. When we delegate, we need to make sure that the people that we delegate to know what's expected, have the skill to do the task. And if they don't, then you can develop them, spend the time to make sure that they have the skill and do they have the desire. So, yeah, I use the KSD all the time, even students. I mean, you mentioned the first day of class as being so important. I want you all to know what's expected.
Yeah.
But when a student doesn't perform well on an exam, I ask myself this question: did they know what was expected of them? Do they have the skill, and do they have the desire?
Yeah. I just got a flashback to a moment in your class, and I was trying to recall exactly what it is, because I think this is also some of your theatrics that you did in both classes. And the value of taking both classes is that, like, I saw what you repeated and like your plans that helped form the class. I don't remember the exact situation that you were painting, but essentially you got very animated. Like, you worked with one of the students. I think you talked to them ahead of time, and you got very animated and very angry, and like so much so that like you threw your marker or whatever very aggressively, like, and got angry at them and like kicked them out of the classroom. And then moments later, like, let them back in and laughed about it. And that just popped into my head while you were talking, but just like another one of the theatrics that sets you apart from other teachers is because, like, as serious and intimidating as you can be, like those, I'll use the word games, that you play in the classroom, like lets students into like a softer side of you that I think is so different from other teachers. Do you remember what that was?
Yeah, and I do it.
You said I do it a lot, yeah.
It was for the labor relations class, and one of the things that we talked about in that labor class, and again, this boils down to leadership. Everybody thinks that unions form because of poor wages and benefits. The reason why we have unions, Starbucks is going through this now, is that they aren't paid enough and their benefits aren't good enough. But that's, Mason, that's a small reason. An art consulting firm has been brought in to help frontline supervisors here. One of the big reasons why unions take hold is of poor leadership. So in this particular case, and I've had students come back to me like 7 or 8 years later and say, of all the things that I remember in the classes that I took, not rationalization, not the R word, they say, we remember when you kicked that kid out of class for pulling out his, but that was to demonstrate.
Pulling out a cell phone?
Yeah.
Is that what it was?
That's what it was. Yeah. The student pulls out the cell phone, and then I just, and again, I talked to that student beforehand. And I had a student this semester, like she started to, like, she was like breathing hard, and I was wondering, is she going to, and it wasn't even happening to her. It was happening to somebody that I kind of looked, and I got to be careful a little bit. But the point that I was trying to make is that humiliation. A lot of times leaders think that they have power through their position. They can humiliate, they can demand, they can tell. And when I kick students, that was to show what bad leadership is. Mm-hmm. And to show what humiliation can do. And the students are scared, and they say, well, we don't want that. We're going to band together. We're going to unionize so we don't get treated like that.
Right. But real quick, what's so like beautiful about that, and I don't know if you intend to do this or not, maybe you can let me know after I say this, but like, not that you would ever react that way, right? Because you're a good leader, right? You would never react that way in that situation, but because you're playing the part of a bad leader who blows up and yells and overreacts, and the students are caught off guard by that because they don't know at the beginning that it's a play. Right. Like, in a way, you're kind of, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but you're kind of showing people what you could be capable of if somebody like really pissed you off, and then you're like, okay, I'd never do that. Yeah. But at the same, like, it's an interesting like mind play that I feel like it's all fun and jokes afterwards, but the students still were like, oh my God, like,
Yeah. This is interesting, and we're unpacking this one event. In some regards, I think you're right. I think that there was one leader at this power station up in Connecticut. He was a Naval Academy guy, and you knew that he had the capacity to be very hard.
That's the word I was looking for.
And so you never wanted to go. You never wanted to get to that point because you knew that he had the capacity to do that. So I think that I think it's important for followers to know that you have the capacity to mean business. That you will have a courageous conversation.
And I think that's also the beauty of that first day of class. I think that was the language that I was looking for. Like that first day of class, you showing that you have the capacity to be stern and to set expectations and to be a hard ass, really.
Yep.
But then the second day of class, when everybody shows back up, taking it down a tier and really never going back up to that level. But everybody in the back of their head realizes that,
I could go there if I wanted.
You could. Yeah. And that you choosing not to is a statement, on its own that like, we could, I'm not going to, this is how I prefer to do class. But like you have that gear.
Yep.
It's an interesting tactic that I've never really seen employed by other teachers. Like it's a very chess move.
Yeah. I think
people are playing checkers.
Maybe. I think, leaders, and Mason, you're hitting on a good point too. The best leaders that I've seen, and maybe I'm giving myself credit here.
Go ahead.
The best leaders that I've seen, they tend to be very purposeful and intentional. They know going into an interaction, okay, this is what I want out of this. This is what I'm going to be purposeful and intentional. Not manipulative, but they're very purposeful and intentional. And I will say for sure that first day of class, that's a purposeful, intentional event. When I screamed at that student, told him, cell phone, get out, slam the door, throw the marker. That is a purposeful and intentional event. And it also gets me to think there are some scholars out there, and we've talked about this in our consulting practice, but I've not talked about it in class. There's this notion of leadership as theater. Leadership as a stage. Leadership is theater.
Entertaining.
Acting, not necessarily entertaining, but acting a role.
Engaging.
All these things are now blending together.
But I see what you mean. And maybe that's the language that I was missing when I was trying to piece together why your class was so much different than other professors' classes that I've had, and why like I cared so much and I stayed engaged. And I think it is the theatrics and the you just keeping everybody tuned in. Whereas other teachers, and I use the word entertainment loosely, not in like a silly, funny sense, but more of just like keeping people's attention, keeping people engaged.
Yep.
That other teachers lacked. And it's like as smart, and I hope this doesn't come off wrong, as smart and as intelligent and helpful as some professors are, I think that entertainment factor is lost, and that's what causes kids to remember classes as being boring or falling asleep during classes or like having trouble staying engaged, is because like the knowledge is great, learning is great, but the excitement of going to class is knowing that you're going to go and be engaged and have a good time. And I feel like that's the professor's responsibility, is to make it fun. Like I see a lot of physics teachers having that engagement in the class because they have a true passion for what they're teaching.
Yep.
And it's like fascinating. I mean, I always liked physics, so maybe that's just a personal thing, But I'll tell you one more thing. I'll tell you what, it is probably super difficult to make a class about union labor interesting.
That is a hard class. Yes.
But you did,
Well, thank you. And again, tying these things together in terms of leadership, go back to this notion of passion. And, I want a leader. I will follow somebody. There was a dean were you here when because you were in a college of business?
I started as Law and Society and then transferred into Parks and Rec.
Parks and Rec. We had a dean, Ahmad Tatunchi was the guy's name. He's now the dean at UT Martin. He's shorter than I am, probably 5'4", 5'5", Iranian. I would follow that. He modeled passion, and I think energy is contagious. So,
Absolutely it is.
I mean, again, great leaders have a high motor. You have a high motor.
I do.
And there's a Frostburg State grad right across the street, Trevor DeVore. He and I have some real estate together. The guy has a high motor, has high energy. People want to follow leaders. I mean, I don't care if we're talking about nuclear, railroads, heavy manufacturing, corrections, which we do, over the past several years, we're doing more and more in jails and corrections. But the best corrections officers, they have some passion behind what they do. And it just draws people along.
Yeah, I've gone, I'm about to turn 25 at the end of this month. And in the time that I've been out of college, or even time in college and before, I've definitely had times of low passion and low motor and low drive. But what gets my motor going is the thought of what's possible, and then recognizing the slow progress towards that, possibility. And funny enough, it almost takes having a really shitty job to give your brain time to fantasize about what you'd rather be doing. Like that times working in the restaurant industry, or times commuting an hour to an office to a job that I didn't hate, but I didn't love.
Yep.
And then, commuting an hour back home. That's a lot of time for your brain to drift into dreamland of what could be possible.
Yeah.
And it's definitely in those down times where you fantasize and you dream, and then eventually realize why am I sitting here? And that's kind of exactly what happened to me. And, from working in Chicago, doing the trade show management, to moving back to Baltimore and going into the mortgage industry for the last 2 years, it's the time spent not doing what I want to do that fuels the fire that I now have and can put towards passions or ventures that I do want to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned Jocko. It sounds like you continue to read and outside. I read a book, and I have a guy that works for us for the consulting firm, Doug Moran. Great coach, he's an elite coach. He turned me on to a book called 4,000 Weeks. If you haven't,
I haven't.
Yeah, if you haven't, I would recommend it. And it talks about it really. It's hard. I think it is hard to fake passion. You can fake it in the short term, but day after day after day, if you're not doing something that you are passionate about, I would. Life is short. We got 4,000 weeks. We got 4,000 weeks.
Oh, that's what that refers to.
Yep. And so we need to think.
It's pretty crazy to put it in that sense.
It is.
Yeah. It's pretty crazy.
I would say that book has had a profound. I've had to do some soul searching. But I read 4,000 Weeks is one of those books. I was in at a winery, and I'm reading a page, and I put the book down, and I just kind of look out for a couple minutes. It's that type of book, so I would highly recommend that.
I'd love to check it out. Let's talk about getting to the high ground.
Yeah.
In leadership. You like that transition?
No, that's pretty good.
Yeah. There's a few more things I wanted to touch on that I picked up from your book, which again, the one I've been reading is Stand Your Ground, Building Honorable Leaders the West Point Way, where you went through and interviewed countless leaders in West Point and outside of it as well, right? Just to learn and pick up on what it is that makes these leaders so impactful.
Yep.
There's a few things that stuck out to me. And one that you touched on in class as well is the difference between a true dilemma
Yeah.
and just a leadership moment.
Yeah. So there's a chapter in the book called Wash Away the Gray. And I probably have gotten more emails, calls on that chapter than any other chapter probably combined. And the essence of that, I sat down with a guy at West Point. He was a full bird colonel, director of nuclear engineering at West Point, had been to Afghanistan, Iraq, 27 years of military service. And I asked him, I said, how many dilemmas do you see on a daily basis? And this guy was a smart guy. He put up his finger, he said, one. And I wrote down one dilemma a day. And he said, no. In his 27 years of active duty service, with tours again in Afghanistan and Iraq, he said, I think I've made in my career probably 1 million decisions. He said, only one classified as a dilemma. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, a dilemma is 2 or more decision points that are equally unfavorable, mutually exclusive. You have to pick one or the other, and you have to decide right then and there. And I've come to believe that is an absolute truth. There's hard decisions. I mean, leaders make hard decisions all the time, but those aren't dilemmas. Dilemmas very rarely happen to us. And, right now, Mason, if you were to transfer to Harvard, you would take a moral philosophy class. And the first day of class, this professor comes in. I guess he's kind of a rock star. I mean, you're at Harvard, so I guess every professor there is a rock star. But he walks into this Hogwarts type of hall, and he begins this moral philosophy class by saying, you're a conductor on a train. The train's barreling down the track at 70 miles an hour. There's a disabled vehicle on the track, a quarter mile down. Do you pull the emergency brake now that could disrupt? Basically, he puts people into a dilemma.
True dilemma.
A true dilemma. But when are these kids ever going to be in that position?
Never. Not that one.
Yeah. And not that one, but I don't even think, and when I reflect on my professional and personal life, I've had two dilemmas, one personally and one professionally, where I had 2 or more decision points that were equally unfavorable. There was going to be a really bad outcome either way. They were mutually exclusive. I had to pick one and could not pick the other, which a lot of times people get. Very rarely are decisions mutually exclusive. I have students that say, I have a dilemma. I don't know whether I need to study for your exam or go out to LG's and have a drink the night before. Well, I say, first off, are those equally unfavorable?
No.
I mean, they're not equally unfavorable. Nor are they mutually exclusive. You could study for 45 minutes, and you could still or you could go and have 1 or 2 drinks at LG's, and you can also study. Very few decisions are mutually exclusive, where you have to pick one and can't pick the other. And in both my cases, personally and professionally, in these dilemmas, there was a time constraint to both. Professionally, probably had like a day to make a decision. And personally, probably had 6 or 7 hours to make a decision. So, these kids at Harvard, I think that's unhelpful for these kids. They're doing this sexy intellectual exercise that'll never happen, and we're failing at the basics: the lying, the cheating, stealing. Nobody talks about the lying, cheating, stealing. We spend all this time and energy training people to navigate dilemmas that they'll never ever see. So,
and that's something. The way that I interpreted that dilemma versus just a moment. And you kind of brought this to light in class when you gave that definition for a dilemma, that it really doesn't happen that often. And that kind of was a little bit of an epiphany moment, because separating those two made me realize that in almost all situations, there's a right and a wrong answer. As simple as that.
Yes.
And we're going to get into the rationalization and excuses conversation here
Yep.
as well. And it's like, there's always a right and a wrong answer. There's always a beneficial and a procrastination,
Yeah.
option. And you can either recognize that. I've worked to recognize both sides of that. And while I still sometimes make the decision, to take the procrastination route on something
So do I.
and put off, things, I think acknowledging the reality of,
Yeah.
of the situation is what kind of helps me to stay true, to the situation.
And just to piggyback off of that, I mean, and nobody ever reads the preface of a book. I can't think of the last time I've read a preface.
I read it.
Did you?
Yeah, I think I got some notes from it.
Okay. Well, in the preface to that book, and Mason, I want to be clear to you.
Go ahead. I'll let you go first.
I want to be clear to you and also to your listeners. I am not a perfect leader. I am far from perfect. I aspire to do better every day. So, I wrote the book, but do I still rationalize? Yeah, I do. I try not to, and I aspire not to. But, and again, to piggyback off your point, most of life's decision points are pretty cut and dry. There's a black and there's a white. It's either right or wrong, morally, ethically. There have been cases where I have made the wrong decision, but I've known that I've made I've known that I'm not doing the right thing here. And so rationalization is when you try to convince yourself that maybe you are doing something right, or it's not a big deal, that my character is not being affected. And I would say, of all the words in Stand Your Ground, the most used word is the R word, rationalization. The honorable leaders that I talked to, they really didn't rationalize. Kind of the Jocko Willink, there's no excuse.
Yeah.
You own it. And so, and that is tough to do, man.
It is tough.
Right now, I don't know if you've been following, if you're an investor, but Netflix. Netflix stock has kind of gone like this, and there's a bunch of reasons why. But I was talking to a student, and they were keeping it real with me, and they said, "Yep, I have I use my cousin's Netflix password." Okay. And we said, oh, come on, is Netflix going to miss $11.99 a month? It's no big deal. I mean, Netflix is $1 billion company.
Right.
What's $11.99 a month? But if everybody did that, and right now, I mean, Netflix is moving to commercials. Their stock has been, and I guess password sharing has been a big issue for Netflix. So, and I called him, and he even acknowledged. He said, "I'm rationalizing. I know it's wrong."
But in that example, wouldn't it be rationalizing or making excuses on Netflix's executive side to blame the downfall of their company on people password sharing?
Yeah, I would. Well, is that an ethical? I would say that is poor. If Netflix is using that as their core reason why they're not performing.
And personally, I'm taking that stance because I also have someone else's Netflix account. I will admit it. Don't come after me. But like if Netflix didn't want people to do it, they could definitely be tougher on that. We might go down a little rabbit hole here that we don't need to dwell on for too long. But
I don't know, man.
I bring this up because it's like, for me, there's definitely a line of important moral decisions, and most things are on that side of the line as important. But when it comes to these like little things, like along the lines of like using somebody else's Netflix password, whether they know I have it or not, things like that seem to get swept. Like, do you put as much importance on, do you think it's important to stick to your morals, even in those small instances?
Okay.
That's where the question where I was going with that.
And this is gonna get heavy, and
Okay.
this is probably gonna get into a courageous conversation here.
Okay.
As well. So, and we talked about courageous conversations, and I don't want to sit in judgment, because I have done things that haven't been right. But if you're asking me, I mean, this is pretty cut and dry, Mason. You know, you're lying and stealing.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about another chapter in there, be big about small things. If you can't nail the small stuff, how can you possibly, when the stakes are raised, and we're not talking about an $11.99 password, we're talking about $300,000 that you may, are you magically going to have? I mean, kind of that
I would
chapter,
argue to say yes.
What's that?
I would argue to say yes. That the morals are much more strict when the stakes are much higher, in my personal opinion, or my personal situation.
Stand Your Ground would argue against that,
Mm-hmm.
and say that you practice on the small stuff,
Mm-hmm.
you nail the small stuff to prepare for the big stuff. And I think we talk about, maybe we've talked about this in class or not, but fake ID, everybody does it. Who cares? The bartender doesn't care, the bouncer doesn't care. But isn't that, again, keeping with being big about small things? It doesn't matter whether he cares. And actually, let's bring back it Jocko Willink. Got to own it. No, that's not the right thing to do. You're lying. So, Stand Your Ground's stance on that is that stealing, using somebody else's password is just wrong.
Yeah, it sounds pretty harsh when you call it stealing. I mean, you're right.
Yeah, you're getting a service that you're not paying for. And interesting, one thing that I'll say about West Point, unique institution, not a perfect institution. But one of the amazing things when I was up there, Mason, there were 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old kids that could recite verbatim the 3 rules of thumb. The first one, does this action attempt to deceive? Number 2, and this relates to you, does this action gain or allow the privilege to which I would not otherwise be entitled? Yeah. You're getting a service without paying for it. Number 3, how would you feel if you were on the receiving end of this action? If everybody, there's a logical part of this, and it's coming to fruition. If everybody shared passwords to Netflix, then
The platform wouldn't sustain.
That's correct.
Everybody would lose it.
Everybody would lose it. And right now we're seeing commercial prices have to get, and everybody does pay for that. I pay more for Netflix because of this. So yeah, man. Again, part of me, if you go back to the preface, I'm not here to judge, and I've done things that I'm not proud of, but without a doubt, and Standard Ground would say sharing a Netflix password is just wrong. Mm-hmm. And there is no difference between a small lie and a big lie. So,
and that's the high ground.
That's the high ground.
One more thing.
I hope you don't. Yeah, this is a courageous conversation.
Oh yeah, but that's the details that I like to get into, because I would say nobody that I've interacted with would take that stance. But you're right. Like, that is, if we're being strict to the morals and what honor really is, you're absolutely right. Like, you can't stand on the pedestal and preach if,
Yeah. And by the way, what gets us to, and you started to go down that route in terms of the R word, rationalization. Well, is Netflix using that? Why does Netflix care if people were sharing it's just $11.99, and are they going to blame their poor performance because I'm stealing their? I think. And the last thing I'll say here, man, it goes back to the cutting the leaves around the grapes. Mm-hmm. If you want to truly be an elite leader, then you got to have behavior. You got to behave in a way that is different from the way most everybody else is. There's 4,000 kids right now at West Point learning, going through this moral development process that would say, Mason, I guess to be an elite leader, you got to do some elite things, and it's in the details. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's cutting the leaves around the grapes. Yeah, I'm not going to borrow my cousin's password for Netflix. Why? Because it's wrong. And it's part of my moral fiber, and I got to nail the small stuff. I go out and cut the leaves around the grapes. If I want to be elite, if you don't want to be, and I think a lot of people, the high ground. We talked about the high ground. Are there 10,000 honorable leaders walking around Maryland right now? I don't think there are.
Probably not,
because it's easy. I want to hit the easy button. I'm just tired, or people just say, I don't even care to be an elite leader. So, yeah, man.
So the last thing I want to touch on here that falls into this, and I think is a good differentiation between elite leaders and just leaders, is your be, know, do model.
Yeah.
Something you said in the book is that the greatest failures in life are because of the being, which we'll get into in a second. Yep. It'll make sense, not the knowing or the doing.
Yep.
And you classify knowing as the process of acquiring new skills,
Yep.
Before taking on a big event, and then doing is executing, planning, organizing, and directing that process. And that many people focus on those two aspects of the skill and the executing.
Yep.
But they don't focus beforehand on being honorable.
That's correct.
And how that affects the knowledge that we seek. I kind of fumbled through that, so
no.
to,
you got it. It's a pretty simple model.
Yeah.
Be, know, do. Be is your character, integrity.
Hmm.
Know is the knowledge that you accumulate. In the real world, as a leader, you are expected to be competent in what you do. You are expected to be competent. You are expected to have knowledge and skills. The other thing as leader that you're expected to do, leaders make things happen. They do stuff. Mm-hmm. They drive performance. But if it's not anchored on integrity, those two things become dangerous. Look at the most dangerous people out there, even historically. Hitler, Osama bin Laden. Did they know a lot? Absolutely. Did they do a lot? Yep. But the foundation was not sound. Their ethical, moral foundation was not sound. So the honorable leaders that I talk to, they put a lot of emphasis on the be. The be, your character influences the knowledge you seek and how you deploy that knowledge.
Beautiful.
Yep.
Well, on that, we can bring this podcast to a conclusion.
Great seeing you.
Dr. Offstein, I'm absolutely honored to be able to have you on the podcast. Anybody out there listening, I highly recommend that you check out the Stand Your Ground. This book is cover to cover packed with just insightful sentences that have made me rethink, a lot of the way that I interact day to day. And again, very grateful to have had you as a professor. What I said at the beginning of the podcast was not a lie. You are the most impactful professor I had. So much so that I took your class intentionally twice.
Oh, thank you. Mason, it's great seeing you. Hopefully our conversation today maybe made you rethink some of the things that we talked about 2 or 3 years ago.
Definitely refreshed
in the book. And I look forward to following your career.
Well, thank you.
Good luck with this podcast. I hope it continues to grow, and
hopefully it pays the bills one day.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you want to plug, that you maybe any books or any work that the company's doing that people, or where they could find your resources?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that first off, I would encourage, Frostburg State is a great university, regional school here in Maryland, and I do want to plug Frostburg State. There is a beautiful story behind Frostburg State that, the miners 130 years ago gave pennies, nickels, and dimes to start Frostburg State so that their kids and their kids' could have a better future. But it started with miners giving, and I think it's a great story. We need to tell that story more. Frostburg State's a good place. I had the other plug, I guess, is, I'm a proud owner, co-founder, principal in Accelerated Leadership Partners. We've worked with Fortune 500 companies, the U.S. Treasury, IRS, doing a lot of work right now with the Department of Commerce, the U.S. Patent and Trade Office. We do great work. So if anybody's interested in strategic planning, executive coaching, or we build best-in-class leadership academies, to reach out to me directly, and yeah, we'd love to.
Cool. And I'll have that website and your contact information down in the description of the video, in case anybody would like to reach out to Dr. O personally.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add?
That's
awesome.
Great seeing you.
Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you are still listening, feel free to check out the other episodes I have in the catalog. As always, video is available on YouTube and Spotify, audio on all other streaming platforms. Dr. O, blessed to have you on. Catch you guys on the next episode.
Great.